Good morning, everyone, and good morning to Bhante Sudaso. He's kindly sharing the Dharma with us this morning, like he does basically every morning. Sadhu, 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 much metta, and also much merit. And welcome to Ela, who also says, thank you very much for the weekend practice. The advice that unsatisfaction can be very subtle and that it is always there, no matter if we see it or not, was very helpful. Very good, very good. And good morning, Bhante, and everyone. And good morning to you, and Kevin, and Dan, and Gabriella, Bradley, Yenny, Galaxy from Malaysia. Lovely. Edward, Diane, Geeta, and Sally and Stacy. Good to see you all. Welcome. So this morning we will be studying the Araṇavibhaṅga Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 139, the analysis of non-conflict, which is a really great sutta.
She says that about every sutta, if you haven't noticed.
Not everyone, but most of the Pali suttas and some other suttas of different traditions as well. Few of them. And welcome to Liz.
Okay, ready?
Yes.
All right. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammāṃ saṅghāṃ namassāmi. So today, as mentioned, we'll be going through the Araṇavibhaṅga Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 139, and I think we're doing this in two parts. So first part today, second part tomorrow, is that correct? I hope so, because it's a long sutta.
Is it? Let me check.
Otherwise, we might be here for a couple of hours.
Correct. Yes,
Okay.
It's 2 sessions.
That's good. The Araṇavibhaṅga Sutta, the analysis of non-conflict. So this is a discourse the Buddha gives about how to avoid conflict, how to prevent unpleasant confrontations and grudge-bearing between you and other people, how to live harmoniously with other people. So as usual, I'll read through the sutta and periodically give some explanations. And then I'll stop about halfway through and we can take some questions, and then we'll finish up the sutta tomorrow. So the sutta begins. First off, I should explain a little bit about the word Araṇavibhaṅga. So Arana, this might actually be a pun the Buddha is making, because Rana means conflict, so Arana means non-conflict, which is the way he seems to be using the word in the sutta. But Arana can also mean solitude. So it can also be an explanation of how to live with a mind of solitude when around others, so that the sense of safety and serenity that comes when we're alone. But that's a possible pun on the meaning here. The word arana in a sutta very clearly means non-conflict, so not engaging in conflict. And vibhaṅga means analysis. Literally it means breaking apart, so clearly analyzing the components of something. The sutta begins. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove at Anathapindika's park. There the Blessed One addressed the monks. Monks! Auspicious sir, those monks replied to the Blessed One. The Blessed One said this. Monks, I will teach an analysis of non-conflict for you. Listen to this and carefully pay attention. I will speak. Yes, Bhante, those monks replied to the Blessed One. The Blessed One said this. One should not be committed to sensual pleasure, which is inferior. the behavior of villagers, the behavior of commoners, ignoble and unbeneficial. One should also not be committed to self-torment, which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. Monks, without approaching either of these two extremes, a moderate path of practice has been awakened to by the Tathagata, which produces vision, produces knowledge, and leads to tranquility, higher knowledge, awakening, and nibbana. So this opening statement here, by the way, is exactly the same as the opening statement of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. So you might recognize this as it appears in that very well-known sutta, as well as in a handful of other places. Then he says, one should understand flattery and one should understand disparagement. Having understood flattery and disparagement, one should neither flatter nor disparage. One should just teach the Dhamma. One should understand the definition of happiness. Having understood the definition of happiness, one should be committed to internal happiness. One is not to gossip, and one is not to make critical remarks about a person who is present. In other words, not to speak critically about someone either behind their back or in front of them. One is to speak unhurriedly, not hurriedly. In other words, not to rush through your words, but to speak slowly and clearly so people can understand you. One is not to insist on using the language of a particular country, and one is not to override conventional terminology. This is the table of contents for the analysis of non-conflict. In other words, he just laid out the framework for the sutta. So these are the things that he's going to be talking about through the course of the sutta. Ayasoma is very happy about this. It's a good sign when somebody gets excited about the table of contents. So first off, the Buddha says, one should not be committed to sensual pleasure, which is inferior, the behavior of villagers, the behavior of commoners, ignoble and unbeneficial. One should also not be committed to self-torment, which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. This is what was said. What does this refer to? Devotion to the elation that arises from pleasure that is connected with sensuality, which is inferior, the behavior of villagers, the behavior of commoners, ignoble and unbeneficial. This phenomenon brings suffering, infliction, anguish, and fever. It is the wrong practice. In other words, pursuing sensual pleasure is not something which brings happiness. It's not something which brings peacefulness. It's not something which ultimately actually makes us joyful. Rather, it's something which brings dukkha. It's something which causes us anguish, which causes us agitation and discomfort. So that's why he says it's the wrong practice. Then he says, non-devotion to the elation that arises from pleasure that is connected with sensuality, etc. This phenomenon is free of suffering, free of infliction, free of anguish, free of fever. It is the right practice. So not being committed to sensuality, not pursuing sensual experiences. Then he says, commitment to self-torment is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. This phenomenon brings suffering, infliction, anguish, and fever. It is the wrong practice. Non-commitment to self-torment, which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. This phenomenon is free of suffering, free of infliction, free of anguish, free of fever. It is the right practice. One should not be committed to sensual pleasure, which is inferior, the behavior of villagers, the behavior of commoners, ignoble, and unbeneficial. One should also not be committed to self-torment, which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. This is what was said, and this is what it refers to. So you might be wondering what this has to do with non-conflict. And actually, elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha lays this out very clearly. He says that in the pursuit of sensual pleasure, people will engage in all kinds of unwholesome activities. Caught up with greed for sensuality, people will kill, steal, cheat on their partners, sexually assault people, tell lies, engage in malicious and divisive speech, consume intoxicants. They'll engage in all manner of unwholesome conduct, even to the point of going to wars, even to the point of causing the death of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. You can see that these days. Why is there 100,000 people dead of this virus in this country right now? Because of greed. It's really simple. It's because at the beginning of the pandemic, people were unwilling to harm the economy by going into lockdown for a while. Why? Greed. Basic reason, greed. As a result, 100,000 people are dead and the economy is tanked anyway. So the complete failure on both fronts. So this is the case. The pursuit of sensuality is inevitably a losing game. You lose in the beginning, you lose in the middle, and you lose in the end. It's a shit cake with a sugar sprinkling on top. So it's really not the way to go about living our lives. And then the opposite practice is commitment to self-torture, self-torment. So actively avoiding anything pleasant and good and enjoyable, and actively seeking to inflict pain and suffering and torment on ourselves. This also is not particularly wise. For one thing, it's painful, it's unpleasant, it's unbeneficial, so it doesn't bring any good results. So at the time of the Buddha, there were many spiritual practitioners who believed that through self-torment, they could wear away their bad karma. That if they just inflicted enough pain on themselves, then their bad karma would go away. The Buddha was really clear that not only is that ineffective, it actually has the opposite result. Torturing yourself just creates more bad karma, which results in even more suffering in the future. So not only is it ineffective, it's actually counterproductive. And in terms of relationships with others, so this also makes for very uncomfortable and unpleasant relationships with other people. If you're engaged in self-torture, then your loved ones are going to be terribly upset. Your friends are going to be very unhappy about it. So it spreads conflict and turmoil. And also it creates distrust. Like, what's wrong with this person? Why are they willingly making themselves miserable? And we do need to make a distinction here between self-torture and renunciation. Because some people, when they encounter Buddhist monastics in particular, they think, oh, these people, they're so ascetic. Why have they given up on happiness? Why have they given up on pleasure? They don't eat dinner. What's wrong with them? They must hate life. They're not interested in sexuality. Well, according to my psychologist, the only people who aren't interested in sex are depressed people and old people, and they're not old, therefore they're depressed. I've actually heard people say these things, by the way. I'm not making this up. I see Aya Soma nodding. So it's important to recognize that in Buddhist practice, renunciation is not self-torture because we're not trying to make ourselves miserable or painful. In fact, we don't actively seek out discomfort or pain. Rather, we recognize that the relentless pursuit of pleasure is futile and causes suffering. And we also recognize that a certain amount of pain and discomfort is an inevitable part of life, so we should be willing to face it with serenity and acceptance. So we're not actively seeking to experience pain, but we don't recoil when it appears. We're not actively seeking pleasure, but we also don't go out of our way to avoid it. So it's a balanced approach, a path of moderation, a path of neither pushing or pulling. So renunciation is the middle way between the extremes of sensual indulgence and self-torture. Then the Buddha says, Without approaching either of these two extremes, a moderate path of practice has been awakened to by the Tathagata, which produces vision, produces knowledge, and leads to tranquility, higher knowledge, awakening, and nibbana. This is what was said. What does this refer to? Just this Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right perspective, right attitude, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So this is what was said, and this is what it refers to. So this is, here he just briefly introduces the Noble Eightfold Path without going into detail. But briefly speaking, when we follow the Noble Eightfold Path, then we're much less likely to get caught up in conflict with other people. What causes conflict? Well, holding wrong view causes conflict. Having malicious or hostile attitudes. So attitudes of greediness and possessiveness, attitudes of cruelty and hostility, that definitely produces conflict. Wrong speech. Lots and lots of conflict comes from wrong speech. So lying, speaking harshly, speaking cruelly, speaking uselessly, speaking divisively, that all causes lots of conflict. Wrong action. So killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, that all causes lots of conflict. Wrong livelihood. Again, engaging in any kind of occupation which is harmful definitely causes conflict. Wrong effort. So wrong effort is making an effort to produce unwholesome mind states and to discard wholesome mind states, which again is going to lead to conflict. When our mind is filled with unwholesome mind states, then we do harmful things to others. We create destructive relationships with others. Wrong mindfulness. So wrong mindfulness is directing our attention in ways that increases our greed, hatred, and delusion. So this also is an example of building up the basis for conflict. The basis for conflict is unwholesome mind states. The basis for conflict is an unwholesome mind. And wrong concentration. So right concentration is samadhi, so the cultivation of jhana, the cultivation of a stable, still, alert, stabilized mind, unified mind. And when we have samadhi, then we're not disturbed. When we have samadhi, then we can control our mind, we can control our thoughts, which then makes it much easier to keep ourselves from straying into the errors of the other 7 aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path. Then the next section, flattery and disparagement, the Buddha says, one should understand flattery and one should understand disparagement. Having understood flattery and disparagement, one should neither flatter nor disparage. One should just teach the Dhamma. This is what was said. What does this refer to? So, not praising people, but not condemning people, but just teaching the Dhamma. So the Buddha says, how is there flattery and disparagement and not the teaching of the Dhamma? When one says, there are those who are committed to sensual pleasure, which is inferior, the behavior of villagers, the behavior of commoners, ignoble and unbeneficial. They all have dukkha, infliction, anguish, and fever. They are all practicing wrongly. Then one disparages some people. You might be thinking, wait, what's wrong with that statement? That sounds fine enough, doesn't it? But as you'll see as we get farther into this sutta, the Buddha gives a different perspective on how to say things properly. When one says, there are those who are not committed to sensual pleasure, which is inferior, the behavior of villagers, the behavior of commoners, ignoble and unbeneficial, they are all free of dukkha, free of infliction, free of anguish, free of fever. They are all practicing rightly. Then one flatters some people. Again, you might be thinking, well, what's wrong with that? And he applies the same thing to self-torment and then to the fetter of existence. He says, when one says there are those who have not abandoned the fetter of existence, they all have dukkha, infliction, anguish, and fever. They are all practicing wrongly. then one disparages some people. When one says there are those who have abandoned the fetter of existence, they are all free of dukkha, free of infliction, free of anguish, free of fever, they're all practicing rightly, then one flatters some people. Again, what's wrong here? The Buddha then says, this is how there is flattery and disparagement and not the teaching of Dhamma. How is there neither flattery nor disparagement and just the teaching of Dhamma? One does not say, there are those who are committed to sensual pleasure, they are all practicing wrongly. When one says, this commitment brings suffering, infliction, anguish, and fever, it is the wrong practice, then one just teaches the Dhamma. So here we can see a clear distinction. So rather than saying, those people who are committed to sensual pleasure are practicing wrongly, instead you simply say, commitment to sensual pleasure brings dukkha, therefore it's the wrong practice. So the difference here is that we're not fixating on people or individuals. We're fixating on the practice itself. We're fixating on the activities themselves and whether those activities bring happiness or suffering, whether those activities lead towards awakening or away from it. So this is a subtle distinction because it's not attacking a person, but rather pointing out the flaws and drawbacks in a course of activity, a course of action. So from a Buddhist standpoint, there's no such thing as an evil person. There's no such thing as an unwholesome person. Because from a Buddhist standpoint, there's no such thing as a person. So if you say he is an evil person, then what you're effectively stating is that his nature is to be evil. You're stating that there is an ongoing person, an ongoing entity, which is inherently evil. But from a Buddhist standpoint, this is completely wrong. From a Buddhist standpoint, rather, there are unwholesome mind states which arise due to causes and conditions and which cease due to changes in those causes and conditions. There is no person. There's simply a temporary bundle of karmic consequences, temporary bundle of karmic results. So rather than attack a non-existent being, instead, one simply points out that when one feeds the causes of dukkha, then one gets the results of dukkha. When one cultivates unwholesome actions, then one gets unpleasant results. This is what he means by neither flattering nor disparaging and just teaching the Dhamma. And he applies the same analysis to the other ones. So one does not say, there are those who are not committed to sensual pleasure, they are all practicing rightly. When one says the absence of this commitment to sensual pleasure, that is free of dukkha, free of infliction, free of anguish, free of fever, it is the right practice, then one just teaches the Dhamma. One does not say there are those who are committed to self-torment, they're all practicing wrongly. When one says this commitment brings suffering, infliction, anguish, and fever, it is the wrong practice. So he applies the same thing to self-torment. And then he says, one does not say there are those who have not abandoned the fetter of existence, they're all practicing wrongly. When one says, when the fetter of existence is not abandoned, then existence is also not abandoned. Then one just teaches the Dhamma. One does not say there are those who have abandoned the fetter of existence, they're all practicing rightly. When one says, when the fetter of existence has been abandoned, then existence is also abandoned, then one just teaches the Dhamma. So here I do need to give a little bit of clarification. The word that's being translated here as existence is bhava, which is not the same as the word attita, which is also commonly translated as existence. So when you see, for example, the Kachana Gota Sutta, where the Buddha talks about the two wrong views of existence and non-existence, the words he's using are attita and natita. So attita literally means there isness. So the quality of something, of being present, the quality of something existing. So the quality it is. And natita means the quality it is not. It does not. It is not present. So there, attita and natita is talking about the idea that something either actually exists or actually doesn't exist. But bhava is referring to individual self-existence, this experience of individual existence. So the fetter of existence, bhava samyojana, is the fetter of, or the flaw, the misperception of reality as being me, an individual separate being, experiencing that which is separate from me, other than me. So that's what we talk about as the fetter of existence, bhava samyojana, which is sometimes translated as the fetter of being or the fetter of becoming, none of which is quite right. The fetter of identity, the fetter of individuality. These are perhaps a bit closer to the meaning, but start to stray a little bit from the root of the word. So bhava comes from the verb bhavati, which just means to be. So being or existence is close to the root of the word. That said, it's good to experiment with different translations. So I might start translating bhava as individuality, because, okay, Ayasoma hates that. It's actually really nice to have an Italian sitting in front of you, because you always know exactly what they're thinking, exactly what they're feeling. So Ajahn Chah, somebody once asked Ajahn Chah if he was telepathic, if he could read minds. And Ajahn Chah said, "Oh, I don't need to read minds. I just need to watch people." So it's like that with Italians. You don't need to read minds, you just need to watch them. They will tell you exactly what they're thinking every moment. So I say, maybe I'll translate bhava as individuality. And she's like, I mean, she probably thought she was all. But trust me, it was very clear what her reaction to that idea was. I'm still going to do it. Oh, there she goes again. Oh my God.
I'm not a fan of virgins.
Do you know that you do this with your face?
No.
Anyway, that one was great. That was a little more subtle but crunch. It was more just like, still though, quite noticeable. Where were we? Yes. So the Buddha says, one should understand flattery and one should understand disparagement. Having understood flattery and disparagement, one should neither flatter nor disparage. One should just teach the Dhamma. This is what was said, and this is what it refers to. So again, not attacking people or individuals on account of their practice, their flawed practice, but rather pointing out that flawed practice brings flawed results. Similarly, not praising people for their good practice, but rather praising the practice itself, pointing out that the practice itself brings good results. Then the Buddha talks about happiness. He says, one should understand the definition of happiness. Having understood the definition of happiness, one should be committed to internal happiness. This is what was said. What does this refer to? Monks, there are these 5 chords of sensuality. What 5? Visible objects cognizable by the eye, which are desirable, appealing, pleasing, enjoyable, sensual, and exciting. Are you excited? Sounds cognizable by the ear, fragrances cognizable by the nose, flavors cognizable by the tongue, and tangible objects cognizable by the body, which are desirable, appealing, pleasing, enjoyable, sensual, and exciting. Monks, these are the 5 chords of sensuality. Monks, any pleasure and elation that arises dependent on these 5 chords of sensuality is called sensual pleasure, dirty pleasure, vulgar pleasure, ignoble pleasure. I say that such pleasure is not to be cultivated, not to be developed, not to be made much of. Such pleasure is to be regarded as dangerous. So for the record, the word translated here as dirty literally means feces. Don't you love the Buddha? Yeah. So this is what ordinary people think of as happiness. Ordinary people think that happiness is seeing pretty things and smelling nice fragrances and eating tasty food and touching pleasant surfaces and having nice sensual experiences. This is what ordinary people think happiness is. And they spend a tremendous amount of time trying to pursue and attain these ordinary kinds of pleasant experiences. But the Buddha says this is filthy pleasure. It's like indulging in feces. There's another lovely sutta, the simile of the feces heap, which is about a beetle, a dung beetle, and the dung beetle gets a big pile of feces, and it stands up on its big pile of feces, and it says, "Look at me, look how amazing I am. I have so much feces. I've got a gigantic pile of feces, and I've eaten so much feces, and I can eat all the feces I want. Aren't I great?" So he says, this is what it's like when we get a lot of nice sensual things, like we buy a lot of useless crap on Amazon, and we're standing on our big pile of random crap from Amazon, and we're like, I have so much feces. I can have all the feces I want. I can have a huge pile of feces in my room. Yay! That's what it's like. So this is a form of pleasure. There's no denying it. So kind of like a pig rolling around in a pile of feces, there's a certain amount of pleasure in that, but it's really disgusting. It's really low. It's vulgar. It doesn't bring any actual long-term benefit. And the process of acquiring that kind of pleasure is not to our benefit. It just gets us stuck deeper and deeper in samsara, which itself is a giant pool of feces. Keep that in mind. So this pursuit of sensual pleasure just gets us stuck deeper and deeper in samsara. It builds up the delusion that sensual pleasure is happiness. It builds up our attachment to sensual pleasure. And all of that weakens our aspiration for awakening. As long as we think that happiness is found through sensual experiences, then we will not seek it through spiritual practice. Or we'll just use spiritual practice as a way of strengthening our sensuality. I've met a lot of people over the years who practice meditation not to attain awakening, but because it makes it a little bit easier for them to enjoy sensuality. I remember a few years back, there was one young person who was coming to our meditation programs pretty regularly. This person was a total sensualist greed type, by the way. They were coming to our meditation programs regularly, and then they signed up for a 10-day retreat. And they came on this 10-day retreat. And a few days in, they had this overwhelming crisis when they realized that Buddhism was about renouncing sensuality, not about enhancing sensuality. And this person came to me and started saying that they had to leave the retreat right away because they were losing their basis of happiness. And I was like, no, you're not. You're discovering a much higher basis of happiness. You're discovering a superior happiness. You're not losing anything. And the person stayed till the end of the retreat, and then we never saw them again. So I think the lesson didn't quite get through.
They didn't get struck by a cow from
that. Well, as far as we know. I mean, I can tell you their name after the live stream. You would know who I'm talking about. Yeah, so the reason why this happened is because this person was just using meditation practice as an add-on to their sensual life. something to make their sensual pleasure a bit more enjoyable. But that's really missing the point. It's really missing the point of Buddhist practice. Buddhist practice is not about making your sensuality a little bit more enticing. It's about getting in touch with a happiness which is superior to sensual happiness. Something which is not filthy, vulgar, and ignoble, but something which is pure, something which is sublime. So the happiness of non-attachment, the happiness of equanimity, the happiness of compassion, the happiness of wisdom. This is far superior to the happiness of sensuality. And it also does not lead to conflict. So when one cultivates this sublime, serene happiness of renunciation, of compassion, of equanimity, of wisdom, then people like you a lot more. And they're much less likely to be in conflict with you. Then the Buddha talks about the jhanas. He says, monks, here a monk who is secluded from sensuality and secluded from unskillful phenomena. Oh, that's interesting. I translated, this is unskillful. I don't normally do that. What does this say? Yeah, normally akusala I would translate as unwholesome, not as unskillful. That's very unusual for me. Okay. Because it means unwholesome. It doesn't mean unskillful. You can have somebody who's very skillful, but is not wholesome at all. So that's not what kusala means. Kusala means spiritually skillful, morally skillful, skillful in terms of developing the factors of enlightenment. So someone who's a skillful murderer is not wholesome. They're skillful, but they're not wholesome. So that should be translated wholesome. So a monk who is secluded from sensuality and from unwholesome phenomena attains and remains in the first jhana, which has thought, has consideration, and has rapture and happiness produced by seclusion. With the tranquilizing of thought and consideration, he attains and remains in the second jhana, which has internal composure, mental unification, is free of thought, free of consideration, and has rapture and happiness produced by concentration. With the dissipation of rapture, he remains equanimous, mindful, and clearly aware, experiencing pleasure with the body, what the noble ones describe as equanimous, mindful, and dwelling happily. He attains and remains in the third jhana. With the abandoning of pleasure, the abandoning of pain, and the previous disappearance of elation and dejection, he attains and remains in the fourth jhana, which has neither pain nor pleasure and has purity of mindfulness and equanimity. This is called the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of tranquility, the pleasure of awakening. I say that such pleasure is to be cultivated, is to be developed, is to be made much of. Such pleasure is not to be regarded as dangerous. This is a really important statement. So these days, there's a lot of meditation teachers who say that jhana is dangerous and that you should not practice jhana. You should not try to get into jhana. That if you get anywhere near jhana, you need to pull back from it. A lot of teachers say that. I don't know what they're talking about. The Buddha clearly says it's not dangerous. Jhana is not dangerous. There's nothing dangerous about it. It's completely harmless. In fact, it's extremely wholesome and extremely beneficial. So the Buddha, he says that the happiness of practicing jhana is the pleasure of renunciation. Because in order to enter jhana, one has to let go of the pursuit of sensuality. One has to let go of those delicious, tasty thoughts that we like to roll around in, like the pig rolling in feces. We have to let go of our pursuit of sensual experiences. So it's like binge watch Game of Thrones, practice jhana. Game of Thrones, jhana. So we've got to renounce the binge watching and focus on meditation. Then we can get jhana. So there's some renunciation involved. There's seclusion. So jhana is easiest to practice if we're not caught up in a lot of socializing. A little bit of talking here and there is not such a problem. But if we're engaging in a lot of talking and socializing, then that stirs up the mind and makes it much harder to practice samadhi. So we also need to be willing to let go of the desire for excessive socializing. The pleasure of tranquility. So soothing the mind. So rather than excitement, we turn the mind towards serenity. So there is a certain pleasure in excitement, in adrenaline, in agitated states of mind. There can be a certain pleasantness there. You feel alive. There's a sense of vitality. But there's also a sense of disturbance and discomfort. So in cultivating jhana, we're cultivating tranquility, a very peaceful, stable, still state of mind. So the pleasure of tranquility. And he calls it the pleasure of awakening. And this is because as one develops jhana, it is necessary for one to cultivate incredibly sharp mindfulness, as well as very strong equanimity. So, of course, this is not full awakening in the sense of enlightenment, but rather it bears qualities which are similar to awakening. So this incredibly sharp, precise mindfulness, the quality of alertness and knowing, is similar to awakening, the sharp, clear knowing that comes with awakening. And that deep, unshakable equanimity of not being battered around by pleasure and pain, elation and depression. Similarly, that's similar to awakening, to the unshakable bliss of awakening. So while jhana is a temporary respite from one's defilements, it does give us a glimpse of what's possible as we cultivate the path to awakening. So again, the Buddha says that jhana is to be cultivated, it's to be developed, it's to be made much of. It is not to be regarded as dangerous. And so this is the kind of sublime, serene happiness that we should be committed to in Buddhist practice. So internal happiness, happiness which doesn't rely on the outside world, but rather comes from our own internal practice. So there's a fake Buddha quote circulating on the internet, which goes something like, happiness comes from within, do not seek it without. So it's one of these cute little fake Buddha quotes, which the Buddha almost certainly never said, but which people like to stick on memes and circulate on Facebook and Instagram. And actually it's reminiscent of this passage. But this passage is quite a bit longer and it would be much harder to stick on a cute little meme. So I can understand why people don't use this passage. It's a little bit clunky. It's not quite meme worthy. But you can see it's that similar meaning. He's like, don't seek happiness in the 5 external senses. Rather, develop internal happiness through cultivating samadhi and practicing jhana. So then he wraps up, one should understand the definition of happiness. Having understood the definition of happiness, one should be committed to internal happiness. So I think at this time we should probably go ahead and stop for the morning and switch to Q&A. So if there's any questions or comments, we can go ahead and take questions and comments at this time.
Thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Bhante says, the other simile for sensuality is the one of the sheep that gets stuck in a patch of thorns. And he made a cringy emoji.
Poor sheep.
Kevin also appreciates, ha ha ha. Yes, great comparison, Amazon dung beetle.
Actually, the simile of the sheep in the thorn patch is very suitable because we're all being led along like sheep. So everyone is telling us like, buy stuff, buying things makes you happy. And we're like, yay, we are sheep, we buy stuff. And then we realize that we're actually doing is just buying a gigantic heap of dukkha. That's all.
Buy one, get one free. And
so that'll be the next Amazon ad campaign. Comes with free dukkha.
Hello, Alicia from Spain. And welcome to Suzanne and Yasmin and Rupa. Good to see you. And Peng, lots of good friends. All right, so Dan says, it is sad, admittedly, it can sound incredible that there is a higher form of pleasure that is non-sensual.
Yeah.
And everybody is, really identifying with this. Yes, it's true. A few days of guarding the senses and woo! Gabriela also says, practicing jhana is a formula in almost every sutta I have read. Mm-hmm. And Sally says, what does being skillful to awakening mean? Could Bhante give some explanation on what does skillful mean and how to train?
So again, I normally use the word wholesome. The Pali word is kusala. Kusala most commonly is translated as wholesome. There's a handful of people who translate it as skillful. I don't most of the time. There's a very small number of places in the suttas where that's a proper translation. But usually its meaning is wholesome. So wholesome means that which leads towards awakening, that which leads towards reducing our greed, hatred, and delusion, that which leads towards developing non-attachment, equanimity, and wisdom. That's basically what wholesome means.
And Gita says, would it be possible to guide us all on a weekend retreat on jhana meditation?
We could. The problem is that a weekend is not much time for getting jhana. Realistically, unless you're really skilled with jhana and you have very supportive conditions in your daily life, less than a month is not much time. Less than a month is not likely to work. If you live a very peaceful life, a very simple life, and you do a lot of meditation, then maybe a week-long retreat you can get jhana, maybe. No guarantees. Yeah, a weekend, it's not going to happen. Yeah, unless you have incredible conditions, it's not going to happen.
Gabriela says, what is the difference between admonishment and rebuke?
Well, these are English words. But briefly speaking, to me, the word rebuke carries a certain harshness, whereas admonishment is a bit more like correction or advice. But yeah, this is getting into English words. I'm usually less interested in picking apart the connotations of English words. I'm usually more interested in picking apart Pali words.
And Diane says, is it possible to appreciate and enjoy sensual pleasures without being attached? The feeling of sunshine on my face makes me happy, but I don't cling to it. Is this a problem?
Ask yourself whether or not you're actually clinging to it. Look closely at the mind. So the Buddha speaks about the danger of welcoming and delighting in sensual pleasures. So this is a bit more subtle. So when we hear words like clinging and grasping and craving, we're like, oh, I'm not craving the feeling of sunshine. I'm not grasping at the feeling of sunshine. I'm not clinging to the feeling of sunshine. But the Buddha says, well, are you welcoming? Abhivadana, are you welcoming it? Are you delighting in it? Abhirata. Do you seek delight in it? Do you approve of it? This is a bit more subtle. So the Buddha is always encouraging us to look at the more subtle aspects of mind, the more subtle layers of mind. If awakening could be attained just through the coarse layers of mind, then every other person would be a Buddha. The world would be packed full of them. And you couldn't walk down the street without running into a few arhats if it was that easy. No, we have to look at the deep, subtle layers of mind. So also, like, you walk outside and you feel the sunshine on your skin, and there's that subtle feeling of like, oh yes, this is nice. Look at that. Look at that more closely. What is that? Is there some trace of welcoming and delighting? Well, that's just a subtle form of desire and attachment. So look at that. So does a Buddha feel the sunshine on its skin? Well, of course. Of course. Does a Buddha recognize it as a sensation to be felt as pleasant? Well, of course. But a Buddha is not the least bit bothered by its presence or its absence. They just see it as a transient phenomenon, something which comes and goes. So there's no welcoming it, there's no delighting in it, there's just acknowledging as it comes and goes. So it's this unshakable, stable bliss, which is not affected by external conditions.
Is seeing bright white light an indication of reaching jhanas, or is this just strong samadhi?
So the Buddha never talks about seeing a bright white light in connection with samadhi. It's not anywhere in the suttas. So where that appears is in some apocryphal texts from 1,000 years after the Buddha. So just to be clear on that. So there's a lot of misunderstanding where over the last 2,500 years, certain viewpoints on meditation practice have developed, and often those then get mixed up with what the Buddha actually said, or mixed up with what's in the suttas. So we need to be clear what's what. So the appearance of a bright white light during meditation practice, the Buddha didn't talk about it. If it was an important element of jhana, he would have mentioned it. Since he didn't mention it, it's probably not important. And these days, if you talk to various teachers, there's a handful of well-known jhana teachers these days in the English-speaking Buddhist world. Some of them say that as you approach jhana, you might see a bright light. Others say you might not. I'm actually only aware of a single jhana teacher who says that you must see a bright light. The others say that you may or may not. And that whether you do or don't is completely beside the point. You just keep doing your meditation practice without worrying about whether or not there's a light appearing. So in my case, I don't see bright lights. It just doesn't happen. But that's fine because it's not a requisite characteristic of jhana. So you don't need to worry about it. So if you are seeing a bright white light, well, that's fine. No problem. But also nothing to get excited about. Just keep fixing the mind on the meditation object, cultivating stability and alertness of mind. And when the conditions are right, you'll enter jhana. Okay.
I'll just mention this. Doesn't the Buddha refer to a certain radiance, though, not visual but mental, says Bradley?
Yeah, and there's different opinions about what the Buddha means by that. The way my preceptor talks about that brightness of mind is more in terms of an energetic vitality with sharp, clear awareness. So not a literal brightness, but more metaphoric brightness. So when and you see this just in the way we talk in English, we say like, "Oh, my mind feels very bright today," or she's very bright. Like we don't mean it in the sense of like she is radiating 200 watts of luminosity. What we mean is that person's mind is very sharp and clear and powerful and energetic and clearly knowing. That's what we mean. So that's how my preceptor usually explains these terms. That's how he would talk about it. So it's not necessarily like literally you visualize a bright glowing ball of light in your mind. It's not necessarily what's meant by this, but rather it's the quality of the mind being bright, the quality of the mind being very alert and awake, energetic, clearly aware, clearly knowing, but also very stable, very peaceful. Okay.
And Bradley also is asking, if you achieve jhana in a retreat setting, how likely is it that you can maintain it in daily life?
Depends on what your daily life is like. If you go back home and flip on the TV and get out your pipe and have some beers and hook up with your partner, then turn on some heavy metal, then yeah, your jhana is not going to last after the retreat, that's for sure. But if you go home and you continue practicing more or less as though you were on retreat, and you make your everyday activities opportunities to maintain mindfulness and equanimity, then yeah, you'll be fine. You can keep it going. It's a bit harder, of course, but you can keep it going.
And Gabriela is asking as well, when we talk about attaining samadhi and jhana, what are the differences between them?
So I can't help but notice that this discourse was about non-conflict, but we're only talking about jhana, which is great. I don't mind talking about jhana, but the sutta actually is about non-conflict. Anyway, what was the question?
When we talk about attaining samadhi and jhana, what are the differences between them?
Oh, well, to some extent, I must admit that I do draw heavily from the approach of Ajahn Chah. And Ajahn Chah used these words more or less interchangeably. In fact, he normally used the word samadhi. He normally wouldn't use the word jhana because when you say the word jhana, then people tend to get all kinds of weird ideas about what that means. And they get very mixed up and lost in their beliefs and opinions and viewpoints and so on about jhana. But you just say samadhi, it's a little bit easier to talk to people without them getting lost in this and that. So Ajahn Chah normally would just use the word samadhi. My preceptor was a bit more willing to use the word jhana, but he also tended to use the word samadhi. In my case, I tend to use the words not quite interchangeably, because jhana actually is a distinct stage in the development of samadhi. But rather, the way I tend to think of it is that when you're unconscious, you have about 0% samadhi, actually slightly above 0% samadhi. In your ordinary everyday life, your samadhi is maybe around 1% or so. And then when you sit down and develop your meditation practice, then your samadhi increases. And so as the percentage of samadhi increases, you get closer to jhana. So jhana is when your samadhi passes a certain critical threshold. So I'm just going to make up some numbers here. You might say that first jhana is about 50% samadhi. Second jhana, 70% samadhi. Third jhana, 85% samadhi. Fourth jhana, 100% samadhi. I just made up these numbers, by the way. Don't take them literally or seriously. But that's more the way I feel about it. I see jhana as just being a natural development, a natural stage of development in the cultivation of samadhi. So samadhi is unification of mind, stabilization of mind.
Great. And by the way, when you said this is about non-conflict, not jhana, then they were like, "LOL, oh no, sorry about that. Oops, we're all drawn to that jhana." But there was a last question from Kevin about jhana that we can quickly address. Are we to understand that jhana practice came later, or was it present from the start of the teachings? I ask because it seems many achieved enlightenment in that time by simply hearing the Dhamma.
Well, jhana practice is all throughout the suttas, all throughout. So I personally believe it was there right from the beginning. That the Buddha talked about jhana from the beginning to the end. As for people who seem to attain awakening without jhana, well, the thing is we don't know what they were practicing prior to hearing that final teaching. So we just get a little snippet from the sutta where the Buddha gives a teaching on not self, and it says, and then the monk attained full enlightenment and such and such. And we're like, wow, that was easy. But what's being left out is that monk spent the last 20 years practicing jhana and cultivating the perception of impermanence, and they were almost enlightened, but they were just a little bit short, and the Buddha just had to give them a little push. So that's something that's important to keep in mind. So we're not getting the full story, we're just getting the concluding paragraph. So the previous chapters of the story, which we don't have, probably include a lot of jhana practice. And there's also past lives. So what were these people doing in past lives? Well, we don't know, but they were probably doing a lot of spiritual practice, which may have included jhana practice.
Okay. And Gabriella actually gave a bit more information on the difference between admonishment and rebuke. What she was referring to was the Pali words apasadana and suvacho dovacho.
No, apasadana I'm translating here as disparagement, like putting people down, which is quite literally what it means. So apa means down. So apasada is like putting someone down. And the word flattery is usada. So the prefix ud, which means up, it's like putting someone up, usada, apasada, putting someone down. So usada, putting them up, apasada, putting them down. So I use flattery and disparagement, which duvacha literally means hard to speak to, and that's sometimes translated hard to admonish. So it's a little bit different. Yeah, not the same at all. This is one reason why it's really important to learn Pali. If you want to get a deep understanding of the suttas, you really need to be able to read them in Pali. Otherwise, you'll always be tripped up over the translations because any English word carries connotations which don't quite match the Pali words. So I've been to a number of Dhamma talks over the years where there was an instructor who did not know Pali and who got really deep into picking apart the etymologies and connotations of English words, which were translations of Pali words, and then coming to weird conclusions based upon the etymologies and connotations of those English words. But etymologies and connotations which were completely unrelated to the Pali terms, had nothing whatsoever to do with the Pali terms. Okay?
And Liz says, the approach to focusing on the action and not the person is invaluable. Much easier not to be emotional about an action, therefore reduces negative feelings about people, such as anger. Mm-hmm.
And May, did you have a question?
Yeah. So, while people get jhana, while they meditate, they can easily get the jhana.
So May is asking if someone gets jhana, can they easily get jhana the next time they meditate? and the answer is it's easier, but it's not necessarily easy because you still need to have the proper conditions. So if the conditions are not good the next time, then it's going to be difficult. So you need to have good supporting conditions. The other thing is that, especially the first time one enters jhana, often we just kind of stumble into it. So almost by accident. So we enter jhana, but we don't necessarily know exactly how we did it or exactly what we did that led to that result. So we kind of stumble into jhana and we have this nice experience and then it ends, but we don't quite know how to get back there. So then the next time we try, we might still be kind of fumbling around, trying to figure out just the right way to position the mind. So it's easier because you know what it feels like and you know what that state of mind is like. But it's not necessarily a guarantee, because until we really understand how to properly position the mind for jhana, then we're going to fumble around and miss it quite a bit. So it gets easier, but it's still not guaranteed.
And Kevin says, okay, question regarding the sutta. The talk was directed at monastics, referencing how unskillful the villagers are. As a villager, is the is the idea to try to adhere to the same monastic codes in that way?
Oh, if you want to attain awakening, yeah, absolutely. And if you don't want to attain awakening, that's fine. You can do whatever you want. And in all fairness, he's not actually saying harsh things about villagers. Rather, he's saying that indulgence in sensuality is the behavior of villagers. So there is this kind of subtle poke where he's implying that the behavior of villagers is not so great. But yeah, if you think of yourself as a villager, well, that's fine. Try to be a hybrid. So try to cultivate as much renunciant spiritual practice as you can. And of course, you're still going to have some villager-like qualities for the time being. And that's understandable. But try to cultivate as much renunciant practice as possible in the meantime. Being reasonable about it. Kind of a slightly over-the-top example of this was there's a person I know who, quite sincere Buddhist practitioner, married to a non-Buddhist, which often causes problems. Very sincere Buddhist practitioner, married to a non-Buddhist. And at some point, he decided that he wanted to start following the 8 precepts. His wife was not very happy about this idea. And the guy was like, well, I'm going to start sleeping on the floor so that I don't break the 3rd precept. And his wife was very unhappy about this idea. So that's an example of maybe not the wisest approach. So we're not actually trying to piss off our spouses. I'm not really sure that's what the Buddha had in mind. So if you do decide that you want to practice like a monastic while you're still a villager, do so carefully.
Oh dear, Kevin said, my wife would probably be stoked. Ha ha ha. Bonus points for your wife. Your wife sounds so cool. I want to meet her. And anyway, Kevin was saying, I didn't take it as a diss. It's more just practically speaking. I always feel like with speech, it's basically like I would be mute in life, not really engage in any conversation since most are unskillful.
Yeah, so one of the accidentally Buddhist things that my dad used to say is he would say, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. He didn't actually follow his own advice, by the way, but it was still great advice.
But also, I think that in the sutta, the Buddha talks about the villagers, because we all start off as villagers, and so as uninstructed worldlings, and then hopefully we're going towards becoming noble disciples. So then that's also in this sutta what he points out. It's not necessarily the form per se, but rather the attitudes of mind that one develops. So otherwise, if it's just the robe that makes the monastic, in Italian we have this very nice saying, l'abito non fa il monaco, which means the robe does not make the monk. So it's the same in the suttas. You see that the Buddha says, if all you needed was a robe, then we would wrap up all the babies that as soon as they're born, and that's it, done deal. So it's the attitude of mind. Then obviously it's more common amongst lay people, just simply because we've all been lay people, and the majority of lay people are not practicing the Buddhist teachings. But then when it comes to people who are practitioners, whether they are lay people or monastics, we're all hopefully committed to the path, and we should all be willing to develop these mind states. As monastics, we make the official commitment to develop this. All right. Well, I think that's all for this morning. Thank you so much, Bhante, for sharing the Dharma as usual. This sutta is beautiful. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. We will be studying the second part of the sutta tomorrow morning. And this evening, Bhante will be speaking about something politics, Buddhism. No.
It's the topic is wise governance, which is what did the Buddha say about politics?
Inspired by Marielle's request. So Marielle, you'd better be online following and asking questions. And then tomorrow, same thing. Oh, Marielle said, woo! Great. So same schedule for the whole week, morning and evening. And we'll see you in a couple of hours. Have a great sadhu.